be a follower? Take the proven path. Your animals deserve the best. With increasing consumer demands and animal nutrition requirements, while maintaining profitable operation, farmers need to keep sustainability and animal wellness at the forefront. For more than 45 years, Zinpro has achieved these goals through extensive research and proven results on trace minerals uptake, absorption, and biological efficacy. Zinc, copper, iron, manganese, and selenium are essential minerals and nutrients. Their addition to animals' feed is vital for growth and development, healthy reproduction, and to fight disease. For a mineral to be utilized by the animal, it has to reach the small intestine and be absorbed in the intestinal cells or enterocytes, later pass into the blood, and finally, the mineral needs to be delivered to the target cells within the body. A bonded mineral is efficiently utilized when it is water-soluble, stable, absorbable, and metabolically available. But do all trace mineral sources available in the market meet these 4 attributes? Let's have a look. Traditionally, trace minerals have been classified as organic or inorganic. The inorganic class provides a source of ionic mineral, but today's animals have higher nutritional requirements than inorganics can meet. Looking at traditional organic sources, most dissociate into ionic mineral in the stomach, like the inorganics, so they tend to have lower economic value. The chemistry of all other minerals does not match that of Zinpro, not providing the same absorption and metabolism. Zinpro created an advanced mineral that is bound to a single amino acid ligand, resulting in the only trace mineral source that meets the 4 criteria and establishing a new category in the industry. Zinpro also identified that the specific amino acids used are important to exceptional mineral uptake. Zinpro performance minerals minimize the various antagonistic interactions that other mineral sources are subject to. Antagonists are agents that can bind or block the mineral in its pathway, making the mineral unavailable to the animal. These negative interactions can occur prior to the enterocyte, in the enterocyte, and after the minerals enter circulation. Metal ions travel through the gastrointestinal tract. Some are captured by antagonists, some will be blocked from uptake, and some will be excreted directly. Zinpro performance minerals reach the intestinal lining. If traditional inorganic and dissociated organic sources reach the enterocyte, they use the metal ion transporter pathway to be absorbed. But this pathway can be blocked by other minerals. Only Zinpro performance minerals utilize a unique pathway for absorption, the amino acid transporter. Once in the enterocyte, ionic minerals can bind to proteins such as metallothionein, which restrict entry of ionic minerals into circulation. Zinpro performance minerals are metabolized differently, entering and leaving circulation in a different form than ionic minerals, being excreted at a slower rate. Due to Zinpro performance minerals being metabolized differently, animals' health and performance are improved, maximizing their genetic potential. Trace minerals play key roles in all animals, improving immunity, reproduction, feed efficiency, hoof and paw health, coat and skin quality, growth, production, and other functions. By using an effective source of mineral, you minimize the need to overfeed trace minerals. Behind the innovative Zinpro performance minerals, there are years of extensive research with more than 250 peer-reviewed papers published. When you choose Zinpro performance minerals, you are choosing scientifically proven products that perform in all animal species, keeping our commitment to animal wellness and a healthier and more sustainable world. This is why Zinpro is in a category of 1. Zinpro, your trusted path to performance.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 6th Pan-European Poultry webinar, which is focused on the eggshell through the eyes of an embryo. Before we start, let's do some housekeeping work. Please be sure to select the interpretation from the menu on the bottom side. You have the options of French, German, Italian, Polish, and Spanish. Please leave it active through the webinar so that you can listen to the translated speech. Please type your questions on the chat panel selected in the menu, and only the panelists will be able to see it. Those questions will be discussed in the Q&A session at the end of all presentations. If you have technical issues, please also send your questions into this chat. So this is the agenda for today. We will start with Dr. Henry van der Brand, followed by me, and finalizing with Jacob Hamidou. We will have about 20 minutes for question and answer section, and I'm hoping to have your questions in the chat. We will start now with Dr. Henry van der Brand presenting the incubation from an eggshell point of view.
Good. Welcome, everyone. My name is Henry van den Brand. I'm an associate professor at Wageningen University. And I was invited by Zimpro to discuss today with you about incubation from an eggshell point of view. Thanks for inviting me. And I would like to discuss a couple of things today with you, which I have summarized here on my next slide. And I want to start with the eggshell structure, particularly focusing on the cuticle, then followed by the eggshell, in particular focusing on the cracks. And then the third topic is translucency related to the eggshell as well. So that's in short the first topic. Then the second topic is conductance in relation to egg weight loss. And finally, I want to address the eggshell cleanness in relation to floor eggs, or maybe it's better to explain it from a simply dirty eggs point of view. And why is the eggshell such an important part of the egg from an incubation perspective? Well, first of all, is that the eggshell is an important for gas exchange. So we have oxygen at one hand entering the egg, and carbon dioxide is releasing from the egg through the eggshell. Additionally, heat is also lost through the eggshell. And finally, from an eggshell cleanliness point of view, the eggshell is a barrier protecting the embryo inside the egg for being penetrated by, for example, a bacteria. So the eggshell is a really important part of the total egg, and thus it is important for the embryo, and thus it is important for incubation, from an incubation perspective. So first I want to focus on the cuticle. And when you simply look from a morphological point of view to the cuticle, then it is the outer layer here, what you see here, of the eggshell. Then more from outside to inside, you see the vertical crystal layer, then the palisade layer, followed by the mammillary, the cone layer, and then finally we have the internal and external shell membrane. And on the right side of this slide, you see an electronic microscopy figure also from this eggshell, and it is here you see the cuticle, then the crystal layer, the palisade layer, the mammalian layer, and followed by the shell membranes. So the cuticle is the most outer layer of this eggshell. And why is the cuticle so important? Well, it is the first line of defense, particularly against pathogens. And the cuticle consists of glycoproteins, and these glycoproteins, they have an antimicrobial activity, meaning that they can kill, for example, E. coli or Salmonella. And from that perspective, it is important that the cuticle is in the best fit the best shape to protect the eggs from penetrating by, for example, E. coli. And here on the right side, you see here when we have eggs with a cuticle here on the x-axis, then you see that more eggs were penetrated by E. coli. And when the eggshell is, the cuticle is a very good shape, then you see that hardly any egg is penetrated by E. coli. So the cuticle is particularly important from a protection point of view by pathogens. Can we select on the quality of the cuticle? The answer is yes, because the heritability is quite high with an H² of 0.38. And that means that selection on cuticle quality is possible. However, and then I come to my next slide, when we simply look particular to our broiler flocks, the cuticle is in general quite poor. And here on the left side, you see a figure of eggs that are colored by the cuticle quality. And then the white eggs means that there is hardly any cuticle available. And the green eggs means that there is a very good cuticle available. When you then look to the right side, you see a normal distribution of a broiler flock in relation to the cuticle quality. Here on the x-axis, you see a measure of cuticle quality. With a low value, it is a very poor cuticle, and with a high value, it is a very good cuticle. And you see this is a normal distribution, but the variation is quite large. When you then relate the cuticle quality to the incubation characteristics, then you see that the effect of the cuticle on the eggshell conductance is quite limited. And also the effect on hatchability and later life performance, the effect is quite limited. So the cuticle itself appears not that important, except from a pathogen point of view. So at that moment, the cuticle becomes important. Okay, the next topic I want to address is the eggshell itself, and particularly in relation to cracks. And then we have to separate different cracks. Here you see on the left side, you see an egg with a hairline crack here. You see in the middle an egg with a larger crack. And on the right side, you see an egg with star cracks, multiple star cracks, to be honest. And how important are cracks for the hatchability and other incubation-related characteristics? Well, this is a study already from 2006 from Kabishi, and they separated the eggs in 3 different categories. They had normal eggs, they had eggs, normal eggs means intact eggs without any cracks. They had eggs with star cracks, and they had eggs with hairline cracks. And when you then look to the egg weight loss of these eggs, then you see the normal and intact eggs has an egg weight loss of approximately 11% between day 0 and 18 of incubation. And at the moment that the eggs had star cracks or hairline cracks, then you see that the egg weight loss was strongly increasing. And when you relay that to the hatcher fertile, then you see the normal intact eggs has an hatchability of approximately 88%. And this strongly decreased at the moment there was a star crack or a hairline crack present to 55% or 39%. When you look to the contamination of the egg, so meaning eggs that are entered by pathogens and that are the eggs that are potentially be bombers or exploders in your incubator, then the percentage is strongly increasing from, let's say, 2.8 to 6.7 to more than 10%. So this is all related to hatchability. But when you then also look to the chicken quality at the moment of hatching, then in intact eggs, the yolk-free body mass, here abbreviated as a UFBM, was 42 grams. But at the moment that you're working with cracked eggs, then the yolk-free body mass is considerably lower. And finally, the residual yolk was not that strongly affected, but particularly in eggs with hairline cracks, the yolk-free body mass was a little bit higher, not significant in this study, but that means that at least there is less yolk used, ending up in a lower hatchling quality. So altogether, we can conclude that a cracked egg is not a hatching egg. So please sort them out, don't place them in your incubator. Then the next question is it important to separate eggs with small cracks compared to eggs with much longer cracks? And this is a very nice study from Salahi et al. 10 years ago. And they separated the eggs in intact eggs, here the control eggs with 1 to 2.5 centimeters of cracks, 2.5 to 3, 3 to 3.5, 3.5 to 4, and further. And when you then look to the control intact eggs, you see the egg weight loss is 12%, more or less comparable to the previous slide. And when there is an egg cracked, regardless of the length of the crack, then you see that the egg weight loss is considerably higher, but not affected at all by the length of the crack. When you look to the heads of fertile, 88% in the intact eggs, and much, much lower in the eggs with a crack. Contaminated eggs, no contaminated eggs in the control, and yes, much more contaminated in eggs with cracks. And the same, you see the same pattern early and mid death of the embryos, low in the intact eggs and much higher in the cracked eggs. So you can conclude based on this slide that the length of the crack is not that important. Simply, a cracked egg is not a hatching egg. However, in some particular cases, and then for example, I'm talking about pure lines, grandparent flocks, parent flocks, you have limited number of eggs. And at that moment, it would be interesting when you can use the cracked egg as an hatching egg. So in that particular case, could it be possible to use these eggs and to prevent the negative effects? And this is a very nice study. It is not published. I obtained it via. And they looked to alternatives to use cracked eggs. Here we have the control group, and we have a group with cracked eggs. When you then look to the egg weight loss, again, you see much higher egg weight loss in the cracked eggs. You see much higher infertile or early death, much higher mid deaths, much higher late deaths, and thus a very, very huge difference in hatchability. And what they then did, they used another group of cracked eggs, but they treated them with medical tape. Medical tape, I have to emphasize. So the crack on the eggs was looked for, was covered with medical tape, and then you see quite astonishing results. So you see that the weight loss was a little bit higher still. You see that the infertile and early death returned to more than less to the control group. The same for mid deaths, late deaths, contaminated eggs, the same, and hatchability almost returned to the level of the control group. So in conclusion, a cracked egg is not a hatching egg, but at the moment that you have a very limited number of eggs, for example, in grandparent flocks, it might be interesting to tape these eggs on the cracks with medical tape And then you can use them eventually as an hatching egg. Okay, the third topic I want to address related to the eggshell itself is translucency or mottling. Well, you all know this type of eggs. We have eggs here with a score 1 that are hardly mottled. You have scored with eggs with a score 3. We call it score 3 with, let's say, 25 to 30, 40% is mottled. And you have eggs that are almost completely mottled with a high translucency. And this translucency is related to the moisture in the egg membranes or in the eggshell. But also the shell matrix fiber architecture of the eggshell itself differs between these eggs. And there are not that many studies done to translucency, particularly not in relation to incubation characteristics. So let's have a look to simply what do we see in practice. And here I have a comparison between two different flocks. And the first flock, that is a quite old flock. This is 55 to 57 weeks of age. And the second flock is 34 to 36 weeks of age, so a prime flock. And when you then look to the distribution of the eggs over the different translucency scores, then you see in the old flock, you see that it is more equally divided. Whereas in the prime flock, in this case, you see that there is a huge number of eggs in score 5, so highly translucent. And that is not normal per definition. Normally, the older flock has a higher translucency score than the younger flock. But in this particular study that we have done quite recently, we did not find that. So there are other factors related to translucency as well. When we then look to how does the eggshell and the membranes look of translucent egg or non-translucent egg, we call it opaque eggs, then you see that in translucent egg, the eggshell in this study from Wang et al., one of the limited studies to translucency, then in translucent eggs, the eggshell plus membranes was thicker, particularly to the eggshell, whereas the membranes were a little bit thinner than in the opaque eggs. When we look to the relationship between translucency in relation to incubation characteristics, then a lot of things is unclear. And it is even more unclear how we can influence the translucency. So we have done a study to that, in which we looked to the effect of trace mineral source, organic versus inorganic, on translucency score, and also in relation to egg weight loss and later life hatching characteristics. So in this study, we replaced zinc, manganese, copper, and selenium from an inorganic source by an organic source. And here you see for the two flocks that I already demonstrated, the prime flock and the old flock, you see the effect on egg weight loss from day 0 to 18 expressed in a percentage. When we now first look to the opaque eggs, then you see that in inorganic, with inorganic trace minerals, you see an egg weight loss of 9.4%. And when we replace the inorganic ones by the organic ones, then the egg weight loss was increased. And the same you see in the old flock as well. However, when we then look to translucent eggs, the score 5 eggs, and you do the same with inorganic and organic trace minerals, then you see indeed in the prime flock that in the inorganic trace mineral source, you see still a lower egg weight loss. However, the difference between the inorganic and the organic is much smaller than with opaque eggs. And this all results in an interaction between translucency score and trace mineral source. What the exact mechanism is still unclear, but it appears that particular in translucent eggs, it appears that the organic trace minerals are playing a more dominant role. What are the consequences on hatchling characteristics? And I show you only the results here for the old breeder flock, Ross 308 broiler chickens. There was no effect on hatching time, no effect on chicken weight, no effect on yolk-free body mass. And I mean yolk-free body mass at the moment of hatching. So not at the moment of pooling, but at the moment of hatching. Residual yolk, no effect. Heart weight, no effect. Liver weight, no effect. In other words, it appears that translucency, or mottling of the eggshell, hardly affects the hatchling characteristics. Okay, that was the first topic, particularly related to the eggshell itself. But now what are the consequences when you look to the eggshell conductance or egg weight loss? Because eggshell quality immediately affects eggshell conductance, and this is in turn related to egg weight loss. When we look to the egg weight loss, it is normally determined between the setting of the eggs and transfer of the eggs at approximately day 18 of incubation. And in a number of studies, it is indicated that the optimal egg weight loss, abbreviated as EWL, is between 12 and 14% for the highest hatchability. However, others and more recent study indicates that a much larger range from 6 to 14 or even 6 to 16% is also okay. And I have shown you here a figure of a very recent study in layer grandparent flocks and layer parent flocks. And each dot presents a batch of eggs. So these are a number of batches of eggs. And when you then look, then you see that here the optimal, the highest level of hatchability was around 10%. In layers, it is normally lower than in broilers, but you see there is hardly any effect between 6 and 14%. It is very, very limited, the effect of egg weight loss on hatchability. So in this study, again, we demonstrated that the egg weight loss can be quite broad before you see negative effects on hatchability. Then the question is, why are we still striving for 12 to 14% of egg weight loss between day 0 and 18 of incubation? Well, that has to do with the huge variation among individual eggs within a batch of eggs. And I have put here the percentage of eggs in relation to egg weight loss between, in this case, day 0 and 19 or 18 and a half. And this is again broiler. And you see here that the majority of the eggs are losing between 9 and 10% in this particular study. But you see a quite huge, nice, normal distribution. But some eggs have a very high egg weight loss. When you then look to the hatchability, that's the orange line here at the top, then you see that there is hardly any relationship between the egg weight loss and the hatchability. But why then striving for, let's say, in this case, 10, 11%? Because at the moment that you have on average a lower or on average a higher egg weight loss, it is possible that some individual eggs have too less egg weight loss or too much egg weight loss, and that might end up in negative effects on hatchability. So on average, striving for 10 to 40% in broiler eggs, maybe a little bit lower, that is fine. However, and I would like to emphasize that, particularly in this presentation, egg weight loss is not that important as long as the eggshell temperature, abbreviated as EST, is optimal. So egg shell temperature is very, very important. Okay, let's implement this information a little bit. So egg weight loss is determined by the egg shell conductance, and there are differences between breeds, for example, layers versus broilers, but also between broiler strains, between layer strains. And this might have consequences for chicken quality at the moment of hatching. And here, this is a study of one of my PhD students, Ampai Nang Xu, and she compared COP 500 and Ross 308 eggs. Same egg weight, but when you look to the egg weight loss from day 1 to 7 in this particular case, then you see that the Ross 308 is losing more weight than the COP 500. It is not that huge, that effect. When you calculate then the conductance of the egg, it's also higher in Ross 308. And that ends up in a higher yolk-free body mass and a lower residual yolk, but also in less chickens with a poor navel at the moment of hatching. How is that possible? We incubate these eggs at exactly the same eggshell temperature, exactly the same breeder age, exactly the same egg weight. How is this possible? Well, that has everything to do with the conductance of the eggshell. So COP 500 eggs have more difficulties with the oxygen and carbon dioxide gas exchange than Ross 308, meaning that COP 500 has less oxygen availability for the embryo than Ross 308. And as a hatchery manager, you should take that into consideration. What are the consequences? I have shown you here on the next slide. When you look to the Ross 308 and COP 500 heat production of the embryo during incubation, you see here on the x-axis the incubation day from day 7 to 18. And what you clearly see is that at from day 15, 16, 17, and 18, that the Ross 308 has a higher heat production. It was significant. The effect is small, but it is consistent. The Ross 308 has a higher heat production than the COP 500. Why? Ross 308 has a higher conductance, more oxygen availability. So with more oxygen availability, you can oxidize more nutrients, ending up in a higher heat production and finally ending up in a better chicken quality. How to deal with that? Well, that probably means that to optimize the balance between oxygen availability and nutrient oxidation, you have to lower the temperature for COP 500 chickens, COP 500 eggs, compared to Ross 308 eggs. By lowering the temperature, you lower the metabolic oxidation, and consequently, with the same amount of oxygen available, you balance the ratio between oxygen availability and nutrient oxidation. Okay, one last topic about egg cleanliness, and I want to focus on floor eggs. But you can say, in general, dirty eggs. And this is a study we did already 6 years ago, or we published that 6 years ago, in which we incubated floor eggs compared to clean eggs, or we washed the floor eggs before setting. And when you then simply look to the percentage of rotten eggs, the potential exploders in your incubator, you don't want to have them in your incubator. You see that with floor eggs and washed floor eggs, you see that the percentage of rotten eggs is strongly increased from 0 to 2 or even 4%. And when you look to the hatchability of set eggs, then you see that it is strongly decreasing at the moment that you are incubating floor eggs or washed floor eggs from 82% in this perspective, in this particular study, to 60 to 63%. So floor eggs strongly lowers hatchability, and washing does not help. The next question is, what are the consequences for the offspring when you rear them? So we rear the chickens in two experiments. In the first experiment, we rear them to day 35 of age. And we had, in this case, the clean eggs again. So the offspring of clean eggs, the offspring of floor eggs, the offspring of washed floor eggs. And we mixed them in a ratio which could happen in practice with 6% of chickens originating from floor eggs, and all the rest were originating from clean eggs. When you then look to the body weight at day 35, then you see in all categories related to floor eggs, dirty eggs, you see that the body weight at day 35 was lower compared to the control, the clean eggs. No effect on feed conversion ratio, and also no effect on mortality. However, in this particular study, the mortality was extremely high. And that had to do because we were in a very hot season at that moment. So there was a lot of heat stress, and then the ventilation failed. So we had a lot of mortality due to overheating. Consequently, we repeated the experiment. The same treatments again. Clean eggs, mixed eggs, floor eggs, and washed eggs, or I have to say offspring of these eggs. The body weight at day 35, no difference at all. Feed conversion ratio, no difference at all. Mortality, no difference at all. What can we conclude? In certain circumstances, floor eggs increases the risk on poor performance. Not in all cases, but in some it does. So I come then finally to my conclusion. I hope I have convinced you that a cracked egg is not a hatching egg. Translucent eggs increase the egg weight loss, but it appears that they have limited effects on incubation and chicken characteristics, although I have to say that we have very limited knowledge about translucent eggs, and it is worth to investigate it more further. Related to egg weight loss, a large range is possible, much more than we originally thought about, as long as the egg shell temperature is optimal. And that is an important remark I want to make here. There are a lot of differences between breeds, between strains, so the egg shell should be adjusted accordingly to obtain the balance between oxygen availability and nutrient oxidation. And my last conclusion is, again, floor eggs are dirty eggs, are no hatching eggs. So that was my presentation. Thank you for listening. When you have questions, you are very welcome. When you have questions at a later stage, here is my email at the bottom of this slide. So don't hesitate to contact me, and then hopefully I can answer all your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, Harry. It was very good. My talk focused on the embryonic battle against incubation stress. In general, good quality eggs are selected and placed for incubation. This means that only clean eggs with intact eggshells should be placed in the setter trays. In this picture, you can see that day-old chicks show bacterial infection in their bones. There are several ways the bacteria can reach the growing embryo, including the presence of microcracks in the eggshell. These eggshells are often misplaced as settable eggs because, unless they are candled, visually the eggshell appears structurally sound. Eggs with hairline cracks have detrimental effects on embryonic growth. It increases water losses during incubation, resulting in lighter day-old chicks and high first week mortality. So microcracks represent an important economical problem for industry. Proper egg management at farm level, as well as trace mineral nutrition, are key factors that prevent formation of microcracks. If we take a close look into the eggshell structure, we can see that the eggshell is on top of the eggshell membrane. This collagen membrane has a unique fiber structure which allows the starting point for the calcification process of the eggshell. These initial sites for calcification are represented by each dot in this diagram. It is known that the number of sites for this initial calcification are directly related with eggshell quality, including eggshell breaking strength. When an egg receives an insult, this stress generated is distributed across the eggshell, generating stress in this zone. The appearance of crack initiation is expected to occur at this area because of this natural irregular surface. If the impact is too strong, these microcracks will develop into visible cracks. When minerals are fed to the hens in the form of trace minerals complex to amino acid, we can see not only an increase on the membrane quality, but also an improvement on the eggshell quality of the eggs, with an important decrease in the incidence of cracked eggs by up to 9%. So if we look at European commercial hatcheries, we see that when hens are fed Zimpro performance minerals, there is a 1.4% reduction on the incidence of microcracks. This translates potentially into 2 extra chicks per hen house. This is because zinc, manganese, copper are key nutrients for building not only a robust eggshell membrane, but they are also important for supporting eggshell calcification. It has been shown that variations in the eggshell membrane has been associated with appearance of translucent spots. Translucent spots refers to those clear spots that you can see in this picture when the light passes through the eggshell. Zimpro developed a tool that helps customers to evaluate the incidence of translucent eggs in the hatchery. This is the blue box. With this tool, it's possible to take pictures of several eggs at a time, save in your computer, and later to evaluate the incidence of translucent eggs, 1, 2, or score 3. Score 1 eggs are those with very few spots on the eggshell, whereas score 3 are those with several translucent spots, as you can see here, distributed across the whole eggshell. Data from more than 10,000 settable eggs measured in commercial hatcheries indicates that there is a substantial increase on the egg weight loss in those eggs score 3, and also a parallel decrease on the hatchability with those high translucent scores. So in addition to protecting the embryo and initiate being important for eggshell calcification, the eggshell membrane may also play an important role on the process of gases exchanges that occurs throughout incubation, and trace minerals play a role in this process. But there's something more that I would like to talk about. The eggshell membrane also lays on top of this vascular plex that surrounds the embryo. This membrane is called chorioallantoid membrane, and it's very important for the embryo because it is very important for mobilizing the calcium from the eggshell that is needed for calcification of the embryonic bones. This membrane has several cellular types that includes zinc-dependent carbonic anhydride enzyme that actually promotes the solubilization and transportation of this calcium from the eggshell into the embryo. This is also the place where gases exchanges occurs. We can see that during embryonic growth, yolk lipids are mobilized and transformed into energy for building the embryo, for growing the tissues. We can see that oxygen consumption by the embryo also increases throughout the incubation. And that's because oxygen is important for converting yolk lipids into energy for the embryo. Iron is an essential trace mineral for this process because it is an important component of several respiratory proteins and respiratory enzymes for this process to happen. In fact, yolk iron is mobilized in the very early stage of incubation when the blood vessels are being formed. Greatest yolk mobilization occurs in parallel to this increase on embryonic development. Growing is a stressful time for the embryo. In parallel to this increase in the oxygen consumption, there is a natural increase in heat production in the third week of incubation, which is a critical time for the embryo in terms of oxidative stress, with free radicals being naturally produced as a consequence of this metabolism. The embryo is able to protect itself against its own metabolic toxic by activating its antioxidant system. This includes several enzymes that complement each other and play key roles on neutralizing free radicals. Those enzymes are dependent on trace minerals. If we take the example of catalase enzyme, this enzyme requires iron to work properly. If we submit the embryos to an extra stress towards the end of incubation by, for example, increasing the incubation temperature by 1 degree, so instead of 37.8, 38 or 39 degrees Celsius, we can see that the embryos respond by increasing the heat production. And there is also a parallel increase on free radical production and oxidative damage. It is also reported that the activity of these antioxidant enzymes increases substantially in order to protect the embryo. So this emphasizes the importance of feeding the hen the correct trace mineral source. In the case of iron, that will support not only overall embryonic growth, gases exchanges, but it will also guarantee that the antioxidant system works well. We have seen that when hens were fed 40 ppm of total supplemented iron as complexed to amino acid, eggs were laid with more iron content, and there was an increase on the hatchability of fertile eggs relative to those hens fed the same levels, but as inorganic iron. The progeny also had a positive carryover effect during grow-out, not only on performance, but also increasing the carcass yield at market age. So Zimpro performance minerals are not only important for supporting the egg when it's being formed in the hen's body. It supports eggshell calcification, eggshell membrane, and egg nutrient content. It also supports the embryonic development at several metabolic routes, such as respiration, antioxidant response, bone growth, and egg weight loss. So it's not only about producing more quality settable eggs, but it's also supporting the embryo and translated into more chicks per hen housed, with a return of investment of 4-to-1. Thank you very much. Now I would like to introduce Jacob Hamidou, which will talk about how to hatch quality eggs into chicks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacob Hamidou. I'm going to speak to you today on how quality chicks hatch from quality eggs. The presentation outline will be as follows: definition of chick quality, important indicators or measures of chick quality. Then I'll give you some summary and some artifacts at the end. What is chick quality? Chick quality is very subjective, which means it depends on the individual who is doing the quality chicks assessment. Chick quality variables may include chicks that are vibrant, looking alert, and are ready to run away from danger, as you can see in these chicks on the left. They should also be uniform in size in terms of the weight, the length, and other parameters. Quality chicks should have well-heeled navels, as you can see in the lower button with chicks with navel buttons, and they must have the appropriate weight that will go to producers. Chick quality can also be assessed on the health of the chicks. A quality chick should have low bacterial contamination, good level of maternal antibodies to be able to withstand infection. Again, well-heeled navel. And by 5 days post-hatch or after incubation, the mortality in the chicks should be less than 0.5%. Bone development is also being used currently to assess chick quality. So we'll be looking at that as well. On this screen, we are looking at the impact of poor chick quality. So if the chick quality doesn't come out what you expect, what happens? In these pictures, you see chicks with some black knobs at their bellies, and those are navel buttons. And then you see in the middle, a chick with some mushy abdomen and a big black button. And then on the right side, you see a very small chick which looks sick, and these are also after incubation. These poor chicks will result in increased feed utilization, poor feed conversion ratio, and they grow very slowly. At the end, they will have low final body weight. This increases cost of production to the producer. What are the factors that affect chick quality? Chick quality can be affected both in the breeder farm and in the hatchery. In the breeder farm, we look at chick quality effect coming from the quality of the eggs. These parameters, such as the genetic selection, the maternal flock age, egg storage, washing of eggs, fumigation, and other factors can affect the quality of the eggs, and that means the chick quality. The quality eggs have to go into the incubation, and we look at embryo quality. Over here, temperature, relative humidity, ventilation, gas exchange, and etc. will have to be monitored well before we can get a quality chicks with good physical look and very healthy. Let's look at, as we go on, we'll be looking at some factors affecting chick quality in various dimensions. In this figure, we look at chick quality in terms of the chick weight, and we measure incubation temperature. Here, the eggs were incubated in the last week of incubation, from 15 days to 21 days of incubation at low temperature 36.5, at a standard temperature of 37, and then at higher temperature of 37.5. Before then, all the eggs were incubated at 37.5 up to 14 days. We realized that the chicks from the low incubation temperature had higher weight, followed by those from the higher temperature, and then those from the standard had lower weight. But all of these were above 43 grams. So can we say that the chicks from the lower temperature are of good quality? In this next graph, we look at the residual yolk sac, or the amount of yolk sac which is left after the chick is hatched. During the later part of incubation, the chick absorbs the rest of the yolk that is left into its belly. When we look at what is left against the temperatures, we see that the chicks from the low temperature have a higher residual yolk sac. and then those from the higher temperature. So we can clearly see that it is the standard temperature that has chicks with lower residual yolk sac. This excess residual yolk sac can lead to what we call yolk sac infection, and it is a result of bacterial infection 3 to 5 days post-hatch if there is a lot of this. How do we measure performance? Based on the naval buttons, which I showed you earlier. In this experiment, we look at hatcheries that are optimized in their chick production, and then those that are less optimized. We measure bad versus naval, bad versus good versus bad navals. In these pictures, the first one on my left at the top, we see chicks with very clean and well-heeled navels. And in the standard hatchery, we measured all the chicks that were received, 67.1% of the chicks received as having that clean navel. 2, we look at chicks that have navel buttons less than 2 millimeters, and they were 27%. In the third category, chicks had navel buttons that were bigger than 2 millimeters, and they had some open navels, and they were 5.6%. Chicks with navel strengths that are coming from the navels were only 1.1%. And chicks that were expected to have unhealed, leaky, and open navels with some fluid coming from the navels were 0%. So we use this to adjudge what a quality hatchery should be. We measure that against another hatchery or group of hatcheries with chicks, and we realize that the chicks with clean and well-heeled navels were only 27%. That is a difference of 40%. Chicks with navel buttons less than 2 millimeters were 30.7%. And those with navel buttons greater than 2 millimeters were 12.9. Navel strengths were 17.7. And chicks with leaky and unhealed navels were 11.7%. These 11.7 chicks are not expected to at least be included in a pool, any hatch of chicks. So if you add that one to the navel strength, that is a lot of numbers, and that is going to affect productivity in the farm. In this section, let's look at a summary. We learned that chick quality is subjective. While one parameter may be true for somebody, somebody may look at it differently. Chick quality is affected by breeder farm and the hatchery factors. Important chick quality indicators that we learned here that are essential for some of us is the excess yolk sac or the residual yolk sac. Then the naval health. We've learned that poor naval health can lead to yolk sac infection and high broiler mortality during the first week of incubation. I take you to the second section where we look at cold storage of hatching eggs, which is one factor, especially in the breeder farm and sometimes in the hatchery, that affects embryo development and chick quality. Cold storage of eggs is very fundamental, very important, and it is practiced everywhere. There may be reasons, including the distance of collecting eggs, where you have to collect eggs from various areas before you can incubate. Then, if you want to also maximize the incubator space, small batches of eggs will have to be stored for some time. If the eggs are going to be stored for a longer period of time, a shorter period of time, the storage temperature could be a bit higher, 17 to 19 degrees Celsius. But if you are going to store the eggs for a much longer time, beyond 8 days to 14 days to 21 days, you need to keep the temperature lower, 14 to 16 degrees Celsius. Now, if we cold store eggs, what are the causes or consequences that could come out? We look here in this graph, we look at cell death. Even before you incubate the eggs, the embryonic cells are responding to the effect of cold storage. You can look at the different categories of cells that you can find in the embryo. You have live cells, cells that are going through early programmed cell death, those in late programmed cell death called late apoptotic and necrosis, and then those that are going through disorganized cell death, necrosis. Realize that when you store the eggs from 4 days to 14 days, the number of or the percentage of live cells drop from about 82% to about 68%. We may be dropping the threshold number of cells beyond a certain level, that may not help in proper embryo development. At the same time, we are increasing the cells that are going through early programmed cell death or apoptosis. What would this result in? In this figure, on the y-axis, that is the embryo size before incubation. You could see it on the surface of the egg yolk in this figure. As you store the eggs longer, the size of the embryo reduces. And that means it is losing cells. And those cells means that the loss of cells could lead to smaller embryo development. What happens when you put those eggs in incubation? Between 4 days and 14 days, we realize that the eggs that were stored for 4 days consistently from 14 days onwards had longer embryo length or embryo weight compared to those that were stored for 14 days. And these embryos could end up being smaller and could affect the quality of the chicks. Is there a solution? We come up with warm heat treatment of eggs in a process called SPIDES. SPIDES is short period of incubation during egg storage. We copy SPIDES from the mother hen. The mother hen lays the eggs 1 a day. So anytime it lays the egg and then it leaves that egg, comes back to sit on the egg and lay the next egg. The first eggs go through period of warm from the mother hen, and that projects them to SPIDES. The cells move away from the cell level in their development to an embryo level, and that stops individual cells from dying. And at the end of the day, the hen will come and sit on all the eggs and then incubate them. So most of the time, those eggs that have experienced SPIDES were laid much earlier could end up hatching better even than those that were laid later. What is the benefit of SPIDES? SPIDES improves the embryo quality. In this study, which we have conducted and yet to be published, we look at the embryo length and we realize that when eggs were stored for 14 days and 21 days, and half of them subjected to SPIDES, we did the warm treatment when they were 10 days, and then for the 21 days, when they were 14 days, we did additional SPIDES. We pulled the data together and realized that the embryo length was consistently longer in those eggs that were subjected to SPIDES. So SPIDES has a good benefit for us. The summary of this section, we have shown that prolonged cold storage of eggs causes cell death. And this cell death is engineered by genes that begin to live, their levels increase, and that leads to the cells die. Death of embryo cells before incubation reduces embryo size before incubation. Reduced embryo size before incubation also reduces the embryo weight and quality during incubation. We have learned that heat treatment can reduce the effect of cell death and increase embryo quality, especially in the early period of incubation. We jump to the third phase. I asked a question earlier that can we use the bone, or some people have been using bones to measure the chick quality. In these pictures, we look at chicks that have some crooked legs and some level of paralysis. What could be causing this? On the right side, we take the leg bone and then we look at the mineralization or the mineral deposits that are there. So what can we do with bones to measure the quality of the bone? We can measure it by the mineral content, the length of the bone, and eventually the strength of the bone. So what is bone mineralization? It is the process of adding minerals to the bone matrix. For proper bone mineralization to happen, there must be a continuous, sustainable, soluble source of calcium, phosphate, and other minerals that are used to fill the bone. So in this picture, when a young bone is formed from the beginning, it has to go through calcification or addition of minerals from the beginning. So you can see in the middle, the minerals being added. And this helps to elongate the bone and also make the bone stronger. In this study conducted by Goose and others look at how eggshell temperature can affect the calcium mineralization in broilers after 42 days of rearing. So during slaughter at 42 days, they check the bone. In the left side, you will see a typical bone. The red area shows more mineralization in the middle, and then the outer ends, which are blue, shows less mineralization. They look at tibia mineral content. At this point, they varied eggshell temperature in the second and the third weeks. And then you realize that when the eggshell temperature in the second and the third week were kept at what is expected to be a standard eggshell temperature for incubation, 37.8, both at the second and the third week of incubation, the bone mineral content was lower. But when the temperatures were varied, either standard or low, or high and low, and then high and standard, the mineral contents were higher. So we could see that the higher temperatures or varying temperatures was increasing the bone mineral content of tibia. In our own study, which we have not published yet, we look at incubation temperature on calcium levels in the tibia after the chicks have hatched. Here, the eggs were incubated, as I said earlier, at 37.5 up to 14 days. And from 15 days to 21 days, we kept the eggs at different incubation temperatures, 36.5, 37, and 37.5. We realized that at day old, 4 weeks post-hatch and 8 weeks on the same feed, the bone calcium levels increased with increasing incubation temperature, and it was that consistent. We have shown the same thing with phosphorus. We also look at the femur length, and we realize that consistently, the bones from the 37 degrees Celsius had longer femur length compared to the two other temperatures. So where do we look at it? 37 is looking at longer bone length, and then the higher the incubation temperature, the higher mineralization. We have learned in this section that mineralization is higher when the eggshell temperature is varied between the second and the third weeks of incubation. However, mineralization increases with increasing incubation temperature in the last week of incubation. We can then suggest that the 37 degrees Celsius is the optimum temperature in the last week of incubation to support proper bone development, which is the bone length and an optimum mineralization, if what we have shown is correct. Where does the calcium and bone minerals come from? They will come from the eggshell. So we want to look at the eggshell. In a typical dry eggshell, it is composed of 94 to 95% calcium carbonate. This calcium carbonate is going to be mobilized for the bone development. Now, on the right side, you see an ultrastructure or typical shell, and it shows the grooves, which are the eggshell pores over here, and then the eggshell runs from the outside to the inner, and the lower side is the eggshell membrane. For a good quality eggshell, it is dependent on the amount of shell that is present in the egg. Also, the shape of the eggshell. So if you have eggs that have bad shells, then it is going to affect the quality of the shell. Then also the shell thickness. We'll look at this much into detail. The quality of the eggshell is, or the thickness of the shell, is affected by the genetic selection, which is different breeds. Then from the maternal flock age, whether they are young, in their mid-age, or in their late age. Also by the breeder nutrition, the level of nutrition or calcium that is added to the diet. And we have been looking at incubation temperatures, which we'll be talking about. In this study, we look at the eggshell thickness over the from 15 days to 20 days that we investigated these eggs at temperatures 36.5, 37, and then 37.5. We realize here that the shell thickness peaked at 16 days at the 37 degrees Celsius and then started declining gradually. However, the lower temperature and the higher temperature, the peakness of the eggshell thickness was later, around 17 and 18 degrees, but the shell thickness reduced slowly. So we can probably say that whatever is inside the shell that is being utilized or is reducing at a much better pace in the 37 than the two other temperatures. How does the eggshell how does the calcium in the eggshell get to the embryo? During early embryonic development, the yolk is in a bigger size. The chorial allantois membrane, which is a highly vascularized membrane that grows away from the embryo, first has to colonize the yolk. And then, as part of metabolism, it starts taking the calcium for the embryo's bone formation. But then the chorial allantois membrane grows gradually to colonize the inner egg shell. And that is where it is going to help to mobilize the calcium for the embryo to use in bone development. This same chorial allantois membrane, as it grows to the end of the shell, it is able to help in gaseous exchange. It brings oxygen through the eggshell pores and then takes out carbon dioxide and water away from the eggshell pores. So we'll be looking at the CAM. So this is again the CAM. In the early development of the CAM, it takes up about 9 to 14 days for the CAM to completely colonize the inner surface of the eggshell. So if the CAM development is very slow, it is going to have detrimental effect on the kind of metabolism and also calcium mobilization during incubation. Here we show that increase in the CAM growth improves gaseous exchange for embryonic development. In severe hypoxia or lack of oxygen, there is reduced CAM function, there is developmental abnormalities in certain organs and in the embryo, and that leads to a lot of embryo mortality. Also, a poor CAM development or low oxygen content available will lead to lower heart development or the cardio. We know that the heart is the organ that pumps blood through the embryo's body, and therefore it also carries oxygen with it. Oxygen is needed for metabolism, and therefore in the lack of oxygen, there is also non-availability of energy for post-heart growth and then development. So we can see an important function of the CAM, from calcium to metabolism to oxygen and to energy. In summary, we have shown that the eggshell supports proper bone development. The CAM helps in respiration and nutrient absorption. Calcium is mobilized from the eggshell by the CAM. Proper CAM development increases the calcium mobilization and results in highest bone development in the second and third weeks of incubation. Now, we've talked about gas exchange with the CAM supported. So we want to look at eggshell conductance or water vapor conductance, which is symbolized as G. The eggshell conductance is the rate at which moisture and gases are able to diffuse across the eggshell. So if you have a poor eggshell, which doesn't allow easy exchange of gases, it's going to have bad effect on the embryo's development. In the picture on the left, all those dots that you see on the surface of the egg are the eggshell pores. Studies have shown that the more you have the pores or the higher pore density, there is greater eggshell conductance. So let's see what happens. In a study that compared the pore density and then the eggshell thickness, it was shown that the blue bars here in this graph shows the eggshell thickness, and then the red bars show the eggshell conductance. Before incubation of the eggs, they had thicker eggshells, but that reduced after incubation. So that proves our earlier graph that the eggshell thickness is reducing, and that may be because it is losing something, and it's likely the minerals. Also, the eggshell conductance was lower at the beginning of before incubation and also increased at the end of incubation. In this picture, you see the eggshell, the inner eggshell before incubation and after incubation. It is much thicker with all the grooves, but if you look at the middle here, you can see a big dip. That is the eggshell pores. But after incubation, you can see there's a depletion of the surface of the eggshell, the inner side. And the depletion is shown here, but then the shell pores reduce. That is what helps to increase the eggshell conductance and therefore gas exchange. Studies have shown previously that as flock age increases, the older the flocks, there is a bigger eggshell. And what shows with bigger eggshell? In this study, it compares small, medium, and large eggs. And it showed that as the egg size increase, there is increasing eggshell conductance. So older flocks would theoretically have greater eggshell conductance or gaseous exchange than younger flocks. Then we look at the eggshell conductance again between breeds. We show here that Ross 308 had higher eggshell conductance than COP 500. In the same study, we showed that in the early part of incubation and in the later part of incubation, Ross 308 had higher embryo metabolism than COP 500. So they will produce more heat because there is higher exchange of gases, they will get the oxygen and they will increase their metabolism of nutrients, and therefore their heat production will go up. What is the interaction between the eggshell conductance and incubation temperature? Studies show that higher eggshell temperatures in eggs that have lower eggshell conductance at the plateau stage of oxygen consumption, it can help to depress organ development, especially the intestines. We know that during the incubation period, the intestines link directly with the yolk sac, and that it helps to mobilize nutrients. And so if the intestine doesn't develop well, it is going to affect absorption and therefore the embryo's development and the post-hatch development. What is the plateau stage of oxygen consumption? In this figure, we have shown that from 16 days up to 20 days, during embryo's metabolism, it gets to a point where the eggshell is a barrier, it is stagnant, but the embryo develops so big that it gets to a point where it cannot grow again. So the eggshell as a barrier will also prevent enough oxygen from entering the egg. And that is what creates that plateau or in the metabolism of the embryo. The only way for the embryo to escape is to break into the inner egg cell, takes the first oxygen there, inflate its lungs, and then prepare for the process of hatching. That is called internal pipping. And then when it finally breaks the eggs, it is called the external pipping. If temperature is increased and gaseous exchange increase, the embryo will struggle if it is in a low G egg, and therefore it doesn't have enough energy to hatch, and that will result in pipping mortality and late stage mortalities. So how does all this metabolism link with bone development? In an optimized metabolism with good gas exchange, good eggshell, the embryo increases its bones by about 1.5-fold in the later stage of incubation, as you can see in this graph. At the same time, it needs to mobilize about 4 times the amount of calcium in the eggshell for its development. And so if you don't have a good quality egg with good quality eggshell, it is going to affect the bone development because general metabolism could also be affected by the embryo. In this section, we have learned that as the eggshell thickness decreases, the egg conductance also increases. The bigger the egg, the larger the number of pores, and the higher the eggshell conductance. Eggshell calcium metabolism is essential for bone development in the last week of incubation by about 4 folds and increases by about 1.5 folds in the bones. The development of calm facilitates metabolism, gas exchange, and proper organ development, especially the heart, leading to higher quality chick. In conclusion, we have learned that quality chick is key to successful broiler operation. There are hatchery and breeder factors affecting chick quality. Therefore, in the breeder farm and in the hatchery, things need to be optimized. Naval health, bone development, conditions of the eggshell can be focal point to improve the chick quality. Temperature, both the eggshell temperature and the incubation temperature are important factors driving the chick quality and then bone development. We conclude here that chick quality, by my definition, is equal to the naval health, the yolk sac, and bone development. And of course, there are other factors that are unknown or are measured by others. These are my university in pictures and some pictures of my lab. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Jacob. It was great presentation, great meeting. Now we open the questions and answers. There are several questions in the chat. Thanks for everyone. I will just, as you just finished, Jacob, I'm taking the lead for you to have the first question. So is there a relationship between egg size and shell pore size? And considering larger eggs, are those more prone to infection throughout those pores and probably more risky for cracks?
Okay, thank you, Sibeli. I hope you can hear me clear. Yes, you asked, is there a relationship?
Yeah, sorry, could you hear me? I will repeat the question, sorry. So is there a relationship between egg size and the number and the size of pores? Are those larger eggs more prone to infections due to the size of the pores?
Thank you very much. And everybody, thanks for listening. Yes, there is relationship between the size of the egg and then the number of pores. Bigger eggs will definitely have a lot of pores. It's all because of the amount of yolk which is bigger and forming the egg, and therefore there will be a bigger stretch of the eggshell or the minerals that will form the eggshell, and you expect that to happen. And that is why in the presentation it shows that they also have a lot more gaseous exchange or the eggshell conductance. And I'm sure your second question was, are they prone to infection more than smaller? I don't think so. I think we learned from Henry's presentation that the cuticle is the membrane that prevents infection into the egg. So as long as your cuticles are well formed, it doesn't matter about the eggshell thickness that will lead to infection. The thickness is more about gaseous exchange and then all about the embryo for metabolism. I hope that is clear.
Henry, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I agree largely with Jacob. And the problem only with the cuticle is that what I also presented in my talk is that in particular in broiler breeds, current broiler breeds, the cuticle is quite often quite poor. And in that particular perspective, you can imagine that when you have when you have eggs from older breeder flocks, which are larger, they have in general thinner eggshells. And at that moment is, in my opinion, a little bit larger risk of pathogenic infections through the eggshell at the moment that your cuticle is not appropriate. And that is in our current breeds quite often the case. So when you have a good cuticle, not that worried. But at the moment that you have a poor cuticle, it might then egg size, eggshell thickness might play a role in indeed the proneness to infections.
And that makes a link for the question from the audience about how to measure cuticle at the research level. Is there a way to measure also the cuticle at farm level?
Well, at research level, we quite often use a spectrophotometry. Sometimes you can use electronic microscopy or X-ray, or different ways. But at farm level, I would like to suggest to use a blue dye simply by coloring the, as I showed in my presentation with the figure in which you see quite nice green eggs, which have a good cuticle, and with almost white eggs when they have a very poor cuticle. So that's the most easiest way you can obtain blue dye from different chemical companies, and then you can color your eggs.
And just wondering, would that be associated with any hatchability effect if a customer wants to do at the farm?
I would like to suggest not to do all your eggs, but simply take a couple of eggs, and then you have a good representation of what is the flock quality, the cuticle and flock level. I have no experiences, to be honest, whether the blue dye can affect hatchability, but I don't believe it that much. But when you take only a small sample, well, the rest you can incubate.
Okay. Jacob, I have a question about the watermarks lines on the eggshells, especially in summertime, in layer type birds. Do you have any experience to share how to deal with those eggs?
Okay, thank you. With watermarks, most of the time, our eggs are coming from colder farms, and then you will, most of the time when the eggs are collected, to prevent the eggs from any spoilage, we put them in cold rooms or in cooler areas. But when you move these eggs right from a colder area and then you bring them to a warmer environment, which is mostly in the summer, the eggs begin to sweat. And so you have to gradually reduce the temperature to be able to reduce those watermarks. But if you just push them right from cold room or a cold environment to a warmer environment, that is expected to happen because the eggs will be sweating. In hatching eggs, that is even very poor because it increases bacterial development on the surface of the eggshells. Thank you.
Very good. Henry, there is a question that it could be for you and for myself as well. So what is the cause of translucent eggs, so mottling? And more details on when the process of analyzing those eggs.
Well, do you start or do I start?
You can start.
Okay. What I also indicated already in my presentation was what are the exact reasons of mottling or translucent eggs? It's largely unknown. We know a few factors, as I presented, that indeed broiler breeder diet mineral source might play a role in the occurrence and of translucency. But age is normally playing a role as well, so that's also a factor. But how to affect it and how severe the mottling or translucency is varies among flocks. So there are a lot of factors that we simply don't know. The second question was, Sibeli?
About the method. How did you analyze those eggs?
Oh yeah, so indeed, what you have to do is you have to wait at least 5 days before you score your translucency, simply because when you do it in completely fresh eggs, you don't see a lot of differences among eggs. So it takes time before you see the translucency between different eggs. So we did it in our experiments at day 5 post oviposition. And then we used the blue box as Sibeli presented in her presentation. And it was all scored by one single person. And then we incubate them separately. So that was what how we approached it in our experiment.
Yeah, so from my side, the eggshell membrane and all the whole talk about translucency is very new. As Dr. Henry mentioned, there's not many research on that. So that's the whole point of this meeting, is to bring a different point of view from the embryo. So we are seeing that the calcified eggshell is dependent on the eggshell membrane. There are studies indicating that the composition of this eggshell membrane, the way the mineralization starts and proceeds afterwards, will have an effect on the quality of the eggshell, and we are linking that with the translucency score. So the data that we are seeing is increases the score, increases the embryonic mortality, increases the under commercial facilities. So different from the study from Henry, which the eggshell was controlled. So we can see a higher impact under commercial facilities on the impact of the high translucency score on embryonic development. And several factors are influencing that, many that we don't know, but we do know that the management, the correct source of trace mineral will play a role, and more to learn. Henry, I have a question, and many questions about the eggshell, the incubation temperature, eggshell temperature. So nowadays we know that 37.5 degrees is the optimum eggshell temperature. So incubators, commercial incubators, set the environment for reaching that eggshell temperature. In that regard, and that's for you as well, Jacob, because you also mentioned on bone formation, what would be the optimal eggshell temperature for best embryonic losses, so gases exchanges and bone development, considering the commercial incubators?
When I may start, we have to realize at the moment that we're talking about setters, let's say with 100,000, 150,000 eggs, then there is absolutely no uniform temperature in such a setter. We have done quite a number of measurements, and then you have at least a variation between the lowest spot and the highest spot, the hottest spot in a setter, that can vary up to 2.5 degrees Celsius. So let's say 4 or 5 Fahrenheit. So you have already, even when you try to homogenize your eggshell temperature, you will have quite a lot of variation. And as Jacob and also we have demonstrated, is that eggshell temperature will affect embryonic development and chicken quality in general, and also particular also on bone formation and bone mineralization. The question is, what is the most important thing? Is that bone, or is that simply chicken quality in general? And when we look to particular later life performance, it is completely clear that a too high temperature, and a too high means above 38.0 degrees Celsius eggshell temperature, will have already detrimental effects on later life performance, mortality, the occurrence of ascites. So overheating is a huge risk, also in very modern current incubators.
Okay, so I'm aware of time. This is great discussion. It's about 2 minutes for finishing. We have several questions still to be answered, and we will address that individually for those that answered. I will just finish saying that after this webinar is concluded, you are going to receive an email with the access for this webinar. This webinar will be available for 1 month, starting from when you receive in 2 days this email. So before logging off, please, we would like to kindly give your opinion about this webinar, complete the survey, and I hope to see you, hopefully face-to-face next year for the 7th Pan European. Thank you very much. Have a great day.